So now it's my pleasure to introduce Siva Vaidhyanathan, our keynote speaker, who Siva is well known for his fantastic books on the impacts of network technology on society, diving into issues as diverse as literature, politics, democracy, music, video games, and of course, fair use. He is one of the earliest library journal movers and shakers, making the list in 2002. And you may come across his work in the Chronicle of Higher Education, the New York Times Magazine, The Nation, Slate, Salon.com. He's also been a contributor to National Public Radio, MSNBC.com, and he once appeared on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Hailing from Buffalo, New York, so there's his roots, Siva did his time as a New Yorker when he worked at NYU from 1999 to 2007. He now lives in Charlottesville, Virginia, and he currently is the Robertson Professor of the Department of Media Studies at the University of Virginia. So please join me in welcoming Siva to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, good morning. I'm thrilled to be here. When Davis invited me a few months ago, I jumped at the invitation. I don't even think the invitation sat in my email box for longer than 10 seconds. Metro's been a really important and inspirational part of my life in ways you might not realize. I basically built my entire career speaking to librarians, and it's been a thrill. As I often tell my editors at various publishing houses, there's no better core audience to sell books than librarians, but also no better core audience to start conversations. And conversations often echo into other areas of life, and that's been tremendously useful to me. It's probably propelled a lot of what I've done, a lot of my work into areas of American life that I never could have predicted, but it's also kept me flying around the country speaking to different library organizations. I think at this point I have spoken to something like 30 state library associations over the past 12 or 13 years. The only library association that I've turned down more than once is the Alaska Library Association, because they keep planning their meeting for February. And when I do finally get to Alaska, I would like to see the sun, at least for a few minutes. But it all started with Metro, actually back in, I think it was 2001. This was either my first or second Major Library Association address, and I came one other time in the middle of the aughts, and I don't quite remember which year. But I've just always found this community to be highly energized. Of course, you know, the best librarians in the world live and work in New York, and are interfacing with so many different constituencies, communities, and there are so many different kinds of libraries. This one organization encompasses every kind of library that we have in this country, and that's exciting too. That means that the conversations that flow out of this meeting are often on the cutting edge. They're better informed. I was also, of course, I accepted this invitation immediately because this is such a great opportunity to address this group and get feedback from this group. But I had no idea that you were going to honor Jim Neal today, and I'm doubly pleased now. I feel like this was the reason I came, because I haven't seen Jim in a few years, and I have been waiting for a chance to thank him for all he's done and congratulate him on his great victories, and now his next stage of life as he's retired from his huge job directing Columbia's libraries. And Jim Neal has been an incredibly important part of my career trajectory as well. I have to thank him personally, but he's been more important to pushing and delving into a lot of the issues that concern all of us deeply, especially copyright. Jim has hosted a number of influential conversations at Columbia. He's participated in so many different groups and boards and reports that have pushed the debate about copyright and its effect on our information ecosystem. He's, as you know, a sterling public speaker. He reaches beyond the fortress of Columbia with ease, which can't be said for everybody who works at Columbia, unfortunately. And what really is amazing about Jim is that, and I'm sure many in this room know it as well as I do, it doesn't matter that he had one of the busiest jobs in the city running that huge organization. He has always taken time to mentor people and inspire people, and he just always enters a room relaxed, which is a really wonderful personality trait, one I wish I would develop. He puts people at ease, and that's meant a tremendous amount to me, and I'm sure to many people in this room. So thank you, Jim, for doing all that you do, and I look forward to many more years of great work, and hopefully we'll be in more rooms together in the next few years. Now, when I started speaking to Metro, I spoke about copyright. That was my early perch in terms of my expertise and what I had to offer, and I got inspiration and a lot of knowledge and wisdom from librarians, and I hope I was able to guide the conversation a little bit. But of course, in recent years, the copyright battles have morphed. In a lot of ways, they've calmed down, right? They're not quite as acerbic as they were. Other things have risen. In many ways, other more important issues, I would say, have risen. We've also, I think in some ways, made our point that the copyright extremism that was so ideologically dominant in the late 1990s and right up through the moral panic over Napster has ebbed. It's not to say that the problems have been solved, but I don't think anyone pretends that maximizing the duration or scope of particular laws or ramping up the penalties for particular abrogations of the law is going to solve the problem as they wish the problems will be solved. That the interface, the interaction between real human beings living cultural lives in a democratic republic and the technologies that we use to communicate with each other is a far more interesting and complex dynamic, a much more complex ecosystem than anyone in any of the copyright industries realized or pretended for many years. Like, we sort of made that point. I just said a whole big string of words. What it really came down to is the fact that, we have to be cultural. We have to interact in the freest, most engaging way possible to satisfy our needs as citizens, cultural citizens and political citizens. This would not surprise James Madison or Thomas Jefferson. They sort of got it, given their technological systems at the time. That has not changed. We just have many more powerful tools with which to do that. And I think that that's kind of where we are in terms of copyright. It doesn't mean that bad laws aren't going to come at us. They have, they will, they continue to come at us largely through the treaty system. Right now we're trying to actually just get some real information about what sorts of details are in the most recent round of trade treaties that will dictate how copyright works around the world as well as in the United States. And that, so we continue to play defense, but it's just a very different environment than it was 12, 13 years ago, where a lot of us in this room had to set out the terms of debate, had to define the debate, had to explain what was at stake in language we had never deployed before, had to take copyright debates out of the law school classrooms and the back rooms at Time Warner and into a digestible public forum. And I think we did that. And one of the weird things is, one of the ways we did that was with the help of Google. Google got the copyright problem early. The folks who worked there, both the engineers and the lawyers, understood that copyright maximalization was folly. That in fact, chances are enough people want to live a different way that they could build all their businesses on this notion that we have an urge to connect, a deep desire to share information, and that the fluidity and flexibility of the World Wide Web as we have experienced it over the last 20 years was such a defining trope of our age and fits so well with our needs as cultural citizens and political citizens that they could ride it. And I think one of the great things about Google's success, financial success, and I think more importantly, cultural success, has been that it got us early. It got the cultural attachment that we found so exciting about the World Wide Web at its dawn. Google also got, by the way, what was scary about the World Wide Web at its dawn, and you probably remember very well how scary it was, especially if you had a little kid in the late 90s, and you knew you wouldn't put your kid down on a stool in front of a computer and say, yeah, look it up, because chances are something horrifying would pop up. Google actually got that as well and has become the custodian of the web in a lot of ways. I have a 9-year-old daughter. I don't fear having her use Google as long as Safe Search is on, because Google tends to that. Google manages the flow of information through its algorithms that are ideologically structured to filter out anything that might alarm me or her, and it works really well. In fact, slowly and steadily, softly and quietly, Google has managed to make the web comfortable. Comfortable enough that we engage in banking, that we engage in commerce at all levels, and that we are fairly comfortable having children deal with this interface. That's a pretty remarkable thing. That change happened in a very short period of time, largely through the concentration of power that Google has over our information ecosystem. So it's a benevolent dictator of the web. And for the last 10 years at least, but probably a bit longer, Google has structured our thoughts and debates about our information ecosystem. Google has essentially imposed its ideology, Googleism, on us. And not just in terms of how we encounter the world, how we find directions, how we figure out what restaurants we should go to based on which ones pop up where and what the reviews are like. That's obvious. But in a lot of other ways that aren't so obvious, Google has served as a model for how our government should run, for better or worse, and I actually would argue for worse. Google has served as a model for how other companies should run themselves and see themselves and structure themselves. I'm agnostic on whether that's better or worse, but I think it's kind of ridiculous, given the fact that the variety of businesses, the variety of commercial enterprises is so vast that Google is basically exceptional. It's exceptional in the talent it attracts. It's exceptional in the role it plays in the world. It's exceptional in terms of the vision of its leaders. There's almost nothing one business can emulate from an exceptional business like that. Yet, if you go to any airport bookstore, you will see about a dozen books on how you can make your company more like Google. And it's actually kind of comical. You can have a lot of fun with them. So Google has managed, though, to essentially define our age. It has imposed a sense of what should matter in life. So ideas that emanate from Google, and Google's not the exclusive source of many of these ideas, but the notion that data should drive everything. Obviously, that's not something that started with Google. You could actually argue it's a bigger part of how General Electric runs itself. But Google has been so stunningly successful at getting its data culture described in other forums that it has influenced how the governor of California structures government services. It has influenced how President Obama wants to structure federal government services. It has, of course, influenced how every other business talks about itself, to the point now where you won't meet a business leader who doesn't say, we are a data-driven company, even if they haven't a clue what that means. But it has influenced things like how we reward and punish public school teachers, how we reward and punish police officers. And that doesn't fit very well. Yet, nonetheless, it's happened. It's been really remarkable. I want to argue, though, that things are on the precipice of change right now. And that's kind of dangerous to me because I have, for the last 3 or 4 years, been trying to sell everyone a book about how important Google is. And now I'm sort of thinking Google's becoming less important. It's not becoming less rich. It's not becoming less powerful. It's still going to be just as big a both problem and solution in the world. But it's going to have, I think, less of an ideological hold on how we see the world and the world's problems. And that's largely because Google is now becoming a victim of its own hubris. Now, Google's mission statement is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible. That is a mission statement that came out of the minds of 2 young men who are about to drop out of graduate school. Before they had made a dime, before they had attracted a dime in venture capital money, they thought, we've got this really cool algorithm. It's solving a problem that not a lot of people have figured out needs to be solved, I would say, with the exception of librarians who understood that that problem needed to be solved. And they sat down, they said, let's form a company, and this will be our mission statement. I mean, the mission statement wasn't, let's make it a lot easier to navigate this fast-growing collection of web documents, because that's sort of the core of what they did. They didn't stop there. They didn't say, let's figure out a better way to sell ads so it's less obtrusive, less annoying, and potentially more lucrative. That's how Google made its many billions of dollars, of course, but they didn't figure that out till they were 3-4 years into their venture. So that wasn't their mission statement. That is basically how they make money. No, their mission statement was to organize the world's information to make it universally accessible. And when I was doing my early research on Google and I came across this phrase, my first thought was, who asked you guys? You know, what the heck? First of all, it's the world's information. It's not yours. Secondly, to organize is not a neutral term. To organize is actually an ideologically fraught term. It implies value judgments at every level, and it involves a whole lot of processes that you probably are not going to be too transparent about, and that's actually how it turned out to be. And so the hubris of Google starts with that. It starts with that. You'll also find, as I found, if you dig into how Google talks about itself and how the leaders of Google talk about the company, that it has a very almost theological bend to it. The mission on Earth is something far more than any company, any other company I know of describes itself or uses. The terminologies are very much about transforming the world, about realizing a vision, about an unfolding. I mean, it's steeped in theological language and yet covered in a candy coating of engineering speak. And it's really fascinating. And that's really what drove my curiosity and resulted in the book, The Googlization of Everything. Because that combination of the hubris of engineering and an almost theological vision of what the world could become if Google got to do all it wants to do, that was irresistible. I don't think there's a more interesting institution in the world right now. And so that should concern us all. And I think it does. It's starting to concern us all. The concerns about Google are growing in both practical and ideological terms. So the resistance that Google has found around the world, in Europe, Europe's fascinating, the way that Europe is dealing with Google right now, for instance. Google usage in Europe is so much higher than it is in the United States. In the United States, Google controls anywhere between 75 and 80% of all search traffic. 75 to 80% in the United States. In Western Europe, it's around 96 to 98%. And it's almost 100% in places like Netherlands and Portugal. And I'm not really sure why. First of all, I'm not sure why there's variation among Western European countries. And I'm not sure why it's so much higher in Europe than it is in the United States. My only hunch is that we have sort of legacy usage through all of those people who first used Yahoo when they got their email address way back in 1998 and used the Yahoo startup page, and they still, or MSN, people who have just fired up a Windows machine that they brought home from Best Buy and start with MSN, and thus are basically starting with Bing these days. That's my only hunch, is that we have this sort of deep-baked legacy of people like my mom, who sort of start with that and have no reason to move because the search seems to resemble every other search. They might then move on to Google for some other search, but that's my only guess. Nonetheless, resistance to Google and efforts to rein in Google with regulation and with lawsuits are pretty fervent in Europe. We have seen criminal prosecution against Google executives for privacy violations in Italy. We have seen really influential civil suits over what's known as the right to be forgotten coming out of Spain that was ultimately heard in the European Court of Justice. We have seen lots of protests, actual street protests in Cambridgeshire, in England, and in Hamburg, Germany, and other places around Europe over Google Street View, where people have actually surrounded the Google Street View cars and stopped them from moving. And we've seen a number of other interventions, largely based on Google Street View, which was very controversial in Europe when it was being rolled out. And Europe, of course, is much more sensitive about data privacy issues. But we've also seen Google recognize its limitations in recent years in the sense that as we spend less and less time interacting with our information flows through these laptops and desktops and web browsers, and more time every day interacting with Facebook or Twitter or WeChat or Weibo or any of the other non-Google-based systems that are now attracting so much of our attention. Google understands it no longer has that prime space as the first place we look when we want to navigate the world or navigate our knowledge systems. And so the folks at Google understand this, which is why they're moving so much of their effort to mobile platforms. It's why they've put so much of their effort into their mobile operating system, which is now the fastest growing and second largest mobile actually, I think it's the largest mobile operating system in the world right now, largely because the Google mobile operating system for phones and tablets is so much more successful in the developing world than Apple is. And so it's growing faster, and it may in fact be larger now than Apple's. So that's been, in some ways, a victory for Google, and yet it doesn't make them a dime. They give away their operating system. They control the flow of data, and that helps with everything else that Google does. It helps refine every service that Google engages in. But what we found finally, starting in 2013, hitting a high in 2014, is a real public resistance and awareness of the extent of data availance or data surveillance and an importance in data privacy. This was always a big factor in Europe. It's starting to spread now. Okay, so given that Google understands things are slipping, I want to introduce the idea of the operating system of your life, or the operating system of our lives. We could be plural about it. Now, an operating system, of course, as you know, determines how resources are going to flow in a system like a computer. It allocates resources, it allocates processing power, it allocates memory. It manages things so that the whole system doesn't crash, but it also makes everything smooth. It's the central nervous system. Right? Now, we've had operating systems on our computers since we've had personal computers. We've had operating systems on our phones since our phones got smart. Actually, before they were smart, they had operating systems. We just didn't call them that. There was a lot less allocation because there were just fewer apps. There might have, in fact, been one application. So this is a very old vision. You can tell by the Windows logo. A very old image of what an operating system does. It's what I show my students because my students all think this stuff is magic. And I often have to start my courses by actually telling them what a computer does and that the word, the verb to compute used to mean something distinct. So what I want to flash back to, though, is an article in 2010 that ran, August 2010, Wired magazine ran this cover story. Chris Anderson, who was the editor at the time, wrote the cover story in which, in typical Wired fashion, he declared something dead. or sometimes the next thing, right? There are only really two wired covers in those days. One, X is dead, or Y is the next big thing, and you better jump on the bandwagon. Wired was almost always wrong about both of those claims, but it didn't matter because the idea was to grab attention and start a conversation and so forth. And so this was kind of ridiculous and kind of controversial. And of course, immediately there were thousands of letters and emails to Wired saying, "What are you talking about? The web isn't dead. I use the web today." Or, "I read your story on the web. Ha ha, got you," right? So, but the point was not that the web is dead. The point was one that I'm trying to build on here, because I think the core of this claim is not wrong or crazy. And that is that steadily, a phenomenon identified actually first by Harvard Law professor Jonathan Zittrain in 2007, but then again by Wired in 2010, is that more and more of our attention, more and more of our time is moving away from these open, customizable systems like personal computers and an open, customizable platform like the World Wide Web, and moving into much more proprietary, lockdown, controlled environments like tablets, like phones, and walled systems like Facebook, which you might think you encounter through the web, and certainly has some play with the web through links, but basically is a walled garden that is virtually unsearchable by anything outside of Facebook. So as we spend more time and attention with these other systems that are not very webby, this article had the virtue of getting us to recognize that there is not one unified thing called the web through which we do everything, but in fact, our information flows occur in all these different areas, and we should probably pay more attention to the specificity of it. Now, of course, the sentence I just said would never sell magazines, which is why I don't edit Condé Nast magazines, and Chris Anderson did. All right, now I want to put forth right now something beyond the web is dead, and that is the internet. That phrase, capital T, capital I, in quotes, is actually not a very useful term anymore. It's not a very useful term anymore. I think it was a useful term. I'm not convinced it's the best way to understand what we're dealing with anymore, for a couple of reasons. And by the way, I'm going to get back to that whole operating system of our lives in a minute. All right. I don't think the internet really describes our information ecosystem the way we often think it does, right? Anytime we're interacting with a digital message from another person, we often assume it's the internet. And when we're staring at our phones, we imagine that we're using the internet. But in fact, we're often not. We're often using very highly controlled proprietary networks run by Apple and AT&T and Sprint and Verizon. And thus, all messages get through with permission of those entities on terms dictated by those entities. Those networks are not open and customizable. They are not neutral. In other words, not every delivery system or delivery starting point is of equal value to every other one. But we have this idea that there is this global information system called the internet. We have this myth that we are connected around the globe by this thing called the internet. And the word internet just means a network of networks. It actually describes the interoperability and interconnectivity of a variety of discrete networks, some private, some public. And we know that connectivity has never been perfect. The experience of dealing with those digital networks in China has never been anything like the experience of dealing with similar digital networks in Canada. Or for that matter, China and Hong Kong have never had the same experience. France and Germany have never had the same experience because local laws dictate different aspects, different interactions. It's not that far apart in France and Germany, but it's actually pretty far apart between France and the United States. And all you have to do is do a Google search on google.fr versus google.com, and you'll see vast differences in what comes up. For a variety of reasons, local law is having a big part to do with it. But even now, what we are seeing in recent years is the heavier hand of the state in places that are ostensibly democratic republics, and actually really are democratic republics despite some demagogic leaders. I'm referring to Turkey and India, two of our most important democratic republics in the world. In fact, the largest being India, now run by a pretty nasty demagogue who is imposing all sorts of censorship throughout Indian society, and that's the least of his crimes. And of course, Turkey, run by a rather arrogant strongman now who is in many ways trying to consolidate power and limit criticism from his enemies, foreign and domestic. And both of these countries have gone through some pretty serious, heavy-handed regulation of digital networks to the point where you cannot pretend that we are on the same internet as people in India or Turkey. And of course, that's long been the case in places like Saudi Arabia and Cuba and Venezuela. So the internet as a global unified information system is a mass illusion. It's a nice piece of speech. It helps simplify a lot of what we're talking about, but of course, every act of simplification hides things that are very important. All right, why is this happening? Why is the internet becoming a less useful notion? For a number of reasons. One, a recognition of massive surveillance. Massive surveillance, which we've found out a lot about in the past 24 months. We found out a lot about what this government has been doing, and not just this government, but the Snowden releases teach us a lot about what the governments of Germany and the United Kingdom have been doing as well. And what's happening, though, around the world is a reaction to that. So, for instance, Brazil, the Brazilian government, which has been very bullish about having a fairly free and open internet as a space for entrepreneurship and civic engagement and cultural enrichment for a long time, is so deeply offended by U.S. policy in these matters and the fact that the U.S. government was spying on the Brazilian government in some pretty over-the-top ways over the past 10 years, that it is now going to require internet service companies like Facebook and Google to store their data with the data that applies to Brazilian users within Brazil. And this is a trend that's going to spread and is already under consideration in a lot of other countries. What this means is not much to Google and Facebook. They already have servers in Brazil, because who wouldn't want to serve Brazil with the fastest possible service? But it's a big problem for the next company that wants to start some sort of influential global service. The next Facebook, the next Google, is going to have a very expensive road if it has to suddenly start up actual infrastructure in every major country in the world to compete. And that's going to be quite daunting and quite expensive. Google and Facebook got into Brazil once they could afford to get into Brazil. But now, these days, you can't afford not to be in Brazil if you're doing this sort of work. So the blowback over massive surveillance has been twofold. One, it has made a lot of people suspicious about the utopian vision that we once kind of considered. We probably all didn't buy into it, but we at least flowed along with it in the late 90s about how the internet was going to liberate the world and food would taste better and everything would be great. Remember that? That didn't really work out. Nonetheless, it's really hard to take seriously any of those fabulous visions of how this stuff is going to change our world when you look at the extent to which states far worse than the United States have managed to monitor its citizens. And then, of course, the blowback is actually the bigger part. Security meltdowns, which now are pretty common, security meltdowns, both state computer systems and private computer systems, should make us all wary about how we interact with these systems. We probably shouldn't have trusted all of these systems with all of our data all of those years, but it's kind of too late. We're already into it. Can you imagine giving up internet banking at this point and going, well, in New York, you'd only have to walk 50 feet to get to a bank. So maybe in New York, it's a different thing, but in the rest of the country, it's actually kind of nice not to have to go to the bank. How do you avoid banks in this town? It's really weird. Like, every Greek diner is now a bank. And I don't know, you don't see people in the banks. I don't know why they do that. Anyway, I guess banks, Dwayne Reed, whatever. All right, and then the other thing is, so I put end of network neutrality in the United States. And you might be saying to yourself, but wait, I just read that things are really good for network neutrality in the United States. Yeah, because the chairman of the FCC finally came around to his boss's way of thinking about this, that perhaps cable broadband should be reclassified in a way that gives the FCC jurisdiction to enforce network neutrality. A lot of us have been urging that for 7, 8 years now, and that's a nice thing, but that doesn't actually fix the whole problem. Getting back to the whole web is dead thing. Let's say cable broadband has enforceable network neutrality imposed upon it, which would fit the general practice anyway. That doesn't solve problem number one, which is lack of competition and slow speeds that come from lack of competition in the cable broadband world. But number two, it doesn't solve the phenomenon or address the phenomenon that increasingly more and more of our interaction with data occurs through wireless proprietary networks for which no one is seriously considering imposing network neutrality or enforcing network neutrality. And so how much longer are we actually going to use cable broadband and all of its flow-overs like Wi-Fi and so forth? For how long are we going to do that? 5 years maybe, and then network neutrality doesn't matter much anymore. But even so, let's say the FCC imposes this reclassification. There's going to be a major blowback from Congress, and we have a president who would veto an anti-network neutrality bill. Sure, but he's only in office for about 2 years now, so we have 2 years of playing defense with the White House and on this, and then who knows who's president next. Democratic or Republican, we could end up with an anti-network neutrality president. So I'm not optimistic about what we've had lasting. And I think that historically that's something really fascinating. When we think back on the last 15 years, this crazy time, all of this free music, all of this creativity, all of this entrepreneurship, all of these utopian dreams, all of that stuff about how the world was going to be so much better when it's all connected, all that pornography, all that stuff that has made the world kind of fun and crazy for the past 20 years, that could be a historical blip. We could be getting back to a highly controlled, highly proprietary information ecosystem with a lot more channels, where what we celebrate is, hey, more movies on Netflix. Actually, now we're looking at less BBC on Netflix. But, that becomes oh, yes, now I get to watch another series with John Goodman in it, and not necessarily that we're celebrating a flowering of creativity or democracy, which was kind of nice to hear. Again, most of us didn't buy it, but, there was a moment, and a long moment, where we thought that's what we were going to get out of this. Instead, we're getting more long-form television series, which I dig. I'm not against that. But is that really what should drive us and satisfy it? All right. The other thing to remember about this big change is embeddedness. We still use this archaic language of going online. Right? We use these spatial metaphors to talk about online versus offline. And in the library world, we do this way too much. Online resources, offline resources. But that doesn't matter anymore. This online, offline, or logging on. Right? There was a time when we had a place in our office or a place in our home, a desk or a table with one computer. And at a certain point, I know I'm describing like 1996 through 99 maybe, at one point during the day, maybe 2 points during the day, you would walk over to that place and sit down and fire up your modem through your phone line and log on to a system. And you would, once you were logged on, you would enter cyberspace, maybe a chat room. And, so there was this notion that I am now in the real world, and yet when I go here and sit down, I'm transforming myself into a being in cyberspace. I'm now online or I'm offline. And there was a clear distinction in our daily habits, but that didn't last very long. Again, we're talking let's say, if you were ahead of the AOL curve, you started doing that around 93, 94, as you probably did if you were heavy in the library world. You might have even used a Unix system to communicate online back in those days. And then by 1990, 2000, we're starting to see the flowering of Wi-Fi in different places. By 2001, we actually have Wi-Fi firing up in important places. And at that point, there's a sense of mobility. There's a sense that these computers can travel with us. By 2005, We start to see the dawning of usable smartphones. Actually, by 2007, you have the first iPhone. Just happened, I know, just happened 7, 8 years ago. But nonetheless, now we are embedded in the digital flow. Our bodies are embedded in the digital flow. And the digital flow is embedded in us. We are nodes in the network now. There is no online or offline. There is no distinction. We carry the data with us. We wade through it. And that's a very different way of living, and it's pretty ubiquitous, remarkably ubiquitous around the world. I think it's something pretty profound. But again, it renders that moment of the online-offline distinction as a limited historical moment. All right, so what's going on here? What's the payoff here? Think about the big companies that are controlling how we think about what's next, and in many ways control our information today. So in addition to these 3 companies, because this was the best logo collection I could find, let's add Microsoft. So Google, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. These 4 big, rich, successful companies, full of brilliant engineers. Maybe Facebook doesn't have that many brilliant engineers, but they have some talented people. But really forward-looking, exciting, right? These are the folks, the CEOs, get to be on Charlie Rose whenever they want. They have a lot of cultural power. They have some political power. They're the giants of our age. They're also on us and in our lives in every possible way. We're marked by these logos every day. And what are they all doing? Think about it. They don't really compete that much. Google and Facebook compete directly for web-based advertising. That's how both of these companies make money, but they compete for our attention in very different ways. They've essentially called a truce over our attention. I mean, they battle for how many minutes per day they have us staring at their services. But they do different things in our lives. You go to Google for certain things that are important, and you go to Facebook for certain things that are important, and you don't really interact. You don't really have a moment where you go, ooh, would this be better searched on Google or Facebook? It doesn't happen that way, right? Or maybe I should use Google Plus to find out what my uncle's doing. No, that never happens either, right? So there's not that much direct interaction in terms of the attention getting, but that's the most direct competition. Think about Apple. Apple produces products that kind of compete with what Google does and what Microsoft does. Apple produces a suite of office software. You probably don't use it. Nobody really does. And so does Google, and so does Microsoft. But of course, we all tend to default to Microsoft and for most things. It at least sets the terms, right? And you end up converting everything to Microsoft Word format before you send it to people anyway. Microsoft leases software. That's most of its business. It also sells Xboxes. That's a huge and growing part of its business. But it doesn't really compete with these companies. Like Apple hasn't produced a game box of any significance, although all of its boxes do games. Apple and Microsoft are kind of competing for desktop operating systems, but that's not really an exciting game right now. And there's not a lot of growth in that market, and everyone knows it. So why do we think of these companies competing? Well, they compete for labor. They compete for talented engineers, and we know that, in fact, they all colluded to keep wages down and keep engineers working in their place for a number of years, and they've now had to pony up a lot of money for committing that crime. It's a pretty nasty thing that they did. But what are they really after? What's their 10 to 20-year plan? Well, their 10 to 20-year plan is actually to be the operating system of our lives. Not the operating system of our computers, not the operating system of our phones or our tablets or our fitness monitors. I have a fitness monitor here. It's not really registering much, unless this is all contributing to my fitness. I don't know. But what they're doing is they want to be the operating system of our automobiles or of our eyeglasses or of our refrigerators or our toasters or our garage door openers or our thermostats. Google just bought Nest, a big home thermostat and energy management company. And every one of these companies is thinking 10 to 20 years ahead because they're anticipating and, just as importantly, self-realizing a notion, a vision, for a point where almost everything important in our lives is embedded in the network as our phones are now, is embedded in this flow of information. So that things that might seem trivial, like a refrigerator, would monitor how much milk you have, the different temperatures in each zone, and report back to you if there was a problem, and remind you to pick up milk. That's feasible. That's technologically feasible. It might be something we actually want. I don't know. Doesn't seem that compelling to me, but I've bought a lot of things I didn't think were compelling up front because I just fell for it. But this kind of vision is one in which the human element is corrected for, right? The human being is a problem in the car, a problem that Google is trying to solve. Google's not the only company trying to solve this problem. It's just the most visible company trying to solve this problem. And it's trying to solve it in a prototypical way. But the idea behind the self-driving car, from Google's point of view, is not just that there be a self-driving car, but that traffic would flow better, that energy usage would go down, that everything would run more efficiently, that everything would be data-driven. But of course, all of this requires an unfettered a level of unfettered access to our movements, our thoughts, our preferences, our associations, everything that we consider to be part of our persona, everything through which we construct and manage our social engagement has to be revealed to whichever company wins the battle to be the operating system of our lives. And it might be one company, it might be some combination of companies, but for everything to work smoothly together, there's probably going to have to be one dominant company. Right now, Google has the lead, although no one's figured out how this is going to make money. Nonetheless, that's the effort. So this notion of ubiquitous data valence, which we think we have now, we haven't seen anything yet, or Google hasn't seen anything yet. These companies are devoted to mastering our flow through the world. And, they don't mean anything bad by it. They actually mean to do us some real favors. They actually want to help us live our lives better, according to their terms of what a better life is. And that's where we have to intervene. Because even in a room here where we're unified by levels of education and professional affiliation, the diversity of what constitutes a good life is vast. And that notion that human beings collectively and individually have different visions of the good gets lost when we are aggregated and mined and then guided, driven by algorithms written by people who share a professional affiliation, one different from ours, who share perhaps even a geographic location, one different than ours, but very different from the people who live in the Appalachian Mountains, in the Rio Grande Valley, very different from those who live in Irian Jaya, very different than those who live in Seoul, South Korea. That sense of diversity, again, individually and collectively, is not being fully accounted for in the vision. It's being fully accounted for in the data, right? The diversity is actually important in the data because it will help customize certain reactions. But the overall value, that efficiency matters, first of all. Efficiency matters, being the prime value. That's something that might not match everything because that's not necessarily important to everybody. So this is what Amazon tells me I should buy. Yeah. Slide's actually a couple years old when my daughter actually wanted a Furby, which Furbies are scary. They're part of the whole embeddedness of data, right? Furbies are smart, they learn. I don't know if anyone here has purchased one or has one. You can admit it, if you like your Furby. The Easy Bake Oven, which she used once and is in a closet, like all other Easy Bake Ovens. But Amazon actually predicted that I would buy a Furby and buy a microwave oven and buy this book by sociologist Saskia Sassen, all of which turned out to be true. It's not that it told me to buy this, it predicted that I would. And I did. It's really a stunning thing that Amazon knows me better than my mom knows me. My mother-in-law actually does better than my mom on these sorts of gift things, but that's another story. All right. And this is where we are now. We're at this moment where it's impossible now to take seriously the distinction between private sector surveillance or data valence and public sector data valence. Because Edward Snowden's releases showed us the extent to which the United States government, the United Kingdom government, and several other governments around the world have managed to either crack the security on private collections of information or enter into partnerships with these companies that collect private information. And in some cases, flat out purchase database information. That's been happening for some time as well. So while we might feel totally comfortable letting Amazon know everything about us, letting Google and Facebook know everything about us, because they don't have police forces, as far as we know. Disney actually kind of has a police force at the parks, but that's, But these companies, look, Google's not going to hurt us, right? What's the problem? And those companies are actually pretty secure. Those companies haven't had those big data meltdowns the way that Visa has, for instance, or most insurance companies have had. But Snowden showed us, through a huge collection of documents and a variety of different programs, that whatever we're giving up to Facebook or Google or Apple or Microsoft is getting to the NSA and probably to other elements of law enforcement and security. Now, of course, like with most of these privacy concerns, it's not going to directly affect many of us unless we're falsely targeted and identified, if we're a part of a false positive, which happens fairly frequently. But this is the sort of awareness I'm convinced is growing. Maybe not in the United States to the extent that it should, but we're having a conversation today in 2015 that we did not have in 2010. We knew this kind of thing was possible. The more paranoid among us were convinced it was happening. The more informed among us had good evidence it was happening. Even the New York Times had good evidence it was happening as early as 2008, although it sat on the story for the important 4 months till after the election. And now, though, there's no denying it. Now there's no denying the fact that the information ecosystem is a unified field of mineable private information, and that people with guns and keys to jails have the same rich level of information and knowledge as those who might do us no harm. So, what is our job here? Our job, librarians, educators, is to demystify. We have, as I said, been living under this sort of mass delusion for a long time that we have a fairly benign global information ecosystem that allows us to chat easily at low marginal cost or zero marginal cost with people in Jakarta, and that's a cool thing. And that should change our consciousness as members of this species. I'm still waiting for that to happen, when all of a sudden the notion that we can connect with people around the world should actually make us more humane. That's sort of the Enlightenment assumption, right? Hasn't happened yet. Maybe it'll happen in a while. But that time is done. Now we have to face the horrible parts of the system that we've built, that we've all colluded in building, even if we haven't all directly profited from it. And we have to ask hard questions, not just as consumers, not just as purchasers, not just as users, but as citizens of a republic. Now, as librarians and educators, our job should be, as I said, to demystify. Because so much of the rhetoric about these changes has been over and above the sort of technological substrate, the real life changes. When we think about the internet, we think about something ethereal. When we think about the web, we think about it being out there, We go online, as I said. But the fact is, we're talking about fiber optic cables, steel, aluminum, concrete, things that use energy, things that exist in the world. We're talking about devices made by human hands, where those humans sometimes lose their hands as those devices are created. And we are not fully accounting for that when we imagine our information ecosystem and when we debate about these issues. We haven't fully taken on this challenge of looking at this economy and this information system as one composed of real human beings making real human decisions about real human beings. That we failed because we keep talking about the cloud. There is no cloud. There are servers. There are thousands of servers, hundreds of thousands of servers sitting in real buildings, running real air conditioning around the world. And this information sits on servers. Some of these servers are vulnerable to security forces in the People's Republic of China breaking in. Some of these servers are vulnerable to security breaches from organized crime syndicates from Ukraine. Some of these servers are just going to fail and burn out. They're all real things. There is no cloud. So the terms we've chosen have not helped. The debates we've had have not helped. Now, the role of the library community over the next 10 years, as we see finally, and I'm so gratified by this, some real heavy questions being laid on Silicon Valley and Google in particular, people asking really hard questions about whether we should let Google get away with this level of power without scrutiny, without regulation. Now that we're finally at, and we may not get the results that I personally want, but I'm so gratified that we're actually having these conversations. The role of the library community in the next 10 years is to define the debate. The libraries around the world should structure our thoughts and debates about information ecosystems for the next 10 years, the way that Google has for the previous 10 years. Google totally stole the thunder of libraries, to the point where Google actually, the guys who run Google pretended to talk like librarians. It was infuriating. They actually talked about preservation, right? That op-ed that Bryn wrote in the Times about 5 years ago about how, what if Stanford Library burns to the ground? You know something I don't know? What's going on here, right? Oh, thank goodness we'll have Google Books and everything at Stanford Library will be saved. You know, as if that qualifies as preservation to anyone who's ever thought about what we're going to need in 50 to 100 years, which Google never thinks about 50 to 100 years. Google's busy worrying about the next 10 years, which is 10 years longer than most companies. Nonetheless, our job is to ask that basic fundamental question. In a democratic republic, what do citizens need? What can we do? What systems should we build? What technology should we use? What skills do we need as citizens to be effective players in the culture, in the economy, in the political sphere, in the republic? Those are questions that librarians, of course, have been asking since the dawn of libraries in North America, but it's more imperative than ever. Libraries have been on the defensive for too long, have been explaining themselves for too long, have been making excuses for too long, have been saying, no, wait, we thought of that. In 1988, we have a report, look, right? For too long. The fact is, the questions over how we are going to have zones of privacy, zones of security, we're going to have areas where we can actually comfortably engage with each other for civic engagement. Those are questions that only librarians are prepared to answer. Only librarians are prepared to lead. Now that, of course, means being more forceful, louder, more sure of ourselves, and ultimately winning a few political arguments at a time when it's a very, very, very bad environment for making those sorts of arguments. I know. I've been making a case like this for about a decade, and every year has been worse than the year before for making these kind of arguments. That doesn't mean we can afford not to. It It certainly doesn't mean that this is how our political environment's going to be for all of the next 20 years. We can't afford not to. If we care at all about how citizens in a republic are going to behave and interact with each other, if we believe at all in the notion of civic engagement, we can't afford not to. So I'm going to leave you with one last thing. I'm going to ask you to buy a book, and it's not going to be one of mine. In May of 2015, you will see, and you'll probably see notices for it sooner, a book by John Palfrey. John Palfrey is the founding chair of the Digital Public Library of America. He's head of school at Phillips Andover Academy, former Harvard Law professor. He has a book coming out called Bibliotech: Why Libraries Matter More Than Ever in the Age of Google. I guarantee you it'll be the most important book about libraries you've read in the last 10 years. I already read it. It's great. It hits every note that I've been singing, but does it so much better than I have. You really should invite him next year. And this book, I think, can really help clarify what the conversation should be like going forth. So buy John Palfrey's book. Thank you very much. Sure. I'll hang out a little bit if you want to ask me questions or argue with me or
Is there anyone who wants to ask me?
Hi, yes. Thank you. Yeah.
It's been a few years since a groundbreaking company, and maybe some would argue a groundbreaking product. And in this age of Google and Facebook and Apple, do you think there will be another one? Do you think there's room for that?
Okay, I don't think we're going to see a company rise from a dorm room or a graduate student lab the ways that Google and Facebook have risen. I think that's very unlikely. It doesn't mean we won't see a company as influential, but the trajectory that Horatio Alger's story that is so compelling is unlikely to happen, largely because of the concentrations of power, largely because that weird playing field, that weird open playing field and level playing field that allowed for companies to come out of nowhere and inventors to come out of nowhere, even if they just got bought, right? The guys who started YouTube quit AOL back when AOL was a joke. It's now, once again, not a joke, weirdly, but it was a joke, right? These guys made up this video platform. No one at AOL cared about it, so they quit. They started YouTube, and then Google bought them out, and they did all right, right? That kind of story, it's less and less likely to happen as we get concentrations of power, as that sector of the economy gets more stabilized, as winners keep winning. So yeah, it doesn't mean we're not going to see cool stuff coming for the next 20 years. It's just going to hit us in different ways. I mean, think about the company that's caused the most buzz over the last 3 or 4 years. It's been Netflix. And Netflix doesn't do anything that special. It achieved a place in our lives by using the U.S. Postal Service to mail things that we were already driving to get. It did so in a really efficient and convenient way, but then it moved into our lives later as an even more convenient service for video. But it doesn't necessarily have much staying power either. I actually don't think Netflix will be around very much longer. It has real trouble negotiating for rights for valuable content. It's lost the rights to thousands of movies in the last 6 months. It lost all its BBC rights. It's basically the big players, the big like Time Warner and Comcast, which are both cable producers, cable providers and content producers, are using their muscle to outbid content providing companies for the licensing, so that and Amazon, which is willing to spend all kinds of cash that Netflix doesn't have, is willing to do the same thing. So Apple has lots of cash it's spending that on rights for streaming and downloading that Netflix can't compete with. So as it loses content and as it gains subscribers, the service actually gets wonkier, and Comcast and Time Warner have no interest in having it actually work well for us. And so, those are the sorts of things. You get a company like Netflix, pretty cool idea, pretty well-run company, and it's likely to get crushed by the incumbents. So, the myth of the internet age when anything goes and anybody can win, I think is pretty much over. Not totally over, but, less and less likely. But what do I know? If I knew what was going to happen in the economy, I'd be wealthy and, yeah. Well, okay, so the question is that, of course, as more pressure comes down on library organizations of every kind, we have lower professional staff levels at almost every library. How can anyone muster the time and energy to do what I'm asking people to do, which is to re-engage with the debate? I don't know, right? But I think it actually works as part of the same debate, because to argue for the value of libraries, to advocate for the value of libraries, addresses both of those problems, right? It addresses the fact that, one of the things that a lot of people started to realize 2008, 2009, as so many Americans became unemployed, is that libraries were more important in the daily life of Americans than anyone had assumed. The only people who write things like who goes to libraries and who needs libraries are people rich enough not to go to libraries. And by 2008 and 9, we had a lot fewer of those than we had just a few years earlier. So making that consistent case for the value in people's daily lives, not a hard case to make, unfortunately, to the actual library users who tend not to be an organized political constituency and tend to have limited political power. That's what we have to do. We have to continue to do, but we also have to inspire some of the actually powerful people in this world that you can't just assume that Google's going to solve all of our information needs in either our economy or our republic. That had been the assumption for way too long. That was the real damage Google did to I think this country and this culture, was displacing the role of libraries in our lives, crowding out the assumed value that libraries had in our lives, and making way too many people think that we could get along without. That doesn't help the fact that municipalities and states and universities all have less money than they did 10 years ago. Those are problems we have to fix at every level anyway. So it really does mean joining up in movements that can help address that problem. We suffered a lot less austerity than Western Europe did, but the austerity we did suffer, which was mostly at the state and local level, was devastating. It was truly devastating. And we really need to have that campaign. Basically we can't afford not to. Otherwise we're just going to wither. And not just as a collection of people who care about libraries and work in libraries. We're going to wither as a country. This is a country that's basically given up on scientific research. Can you imagine the United States of America giving up on scientific research? That happened over the past 10 years. We have flattened out our scientific research budgets, actually cut them because there have been no increases for inflation over the past 10 years, at the very moment when we trained more scientists, because that's what we were telling people they should do. So now we have legions of unemployed scientists, people with PhDs who can't get jobs in science, at the very moment that pharmaceutical companies are laying people off, that various other engineering companies are laying people off. It's crazy that we did this, that this country, the wealthiest country in the history of our planet, is giving up on science, is giving up on libraries, can't afford knowledge. That doesn't at all track with our sense of ourselves, but that's because we just let this happen without having a blunt discussion about it. I'm not cheering you up at all. Yeah, hi.
Actually, we're going to stop here so
Yeah.
we can set up for the next session, but thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
it.
I'm not hopeless. I'm not without hope. I think we can do this. It's just going to take a long time. But again, we can't afford not to. Thank you.